is Covering the Spread, part of the FanDuel Podcast Network.
Conference play is just around the corner for the men's college basketball season, which means it is time to check in with one of our favorites here, John Rothstein, swinging by for today. We're going to talk to him about the landscape across men's college basketball for the opening part of this year, break down the top of the nation, break down key takeaways, and much more to get our first check-in across the nation for this year. This is Covering the Spread right here on the FanDuel Podcast Network and numberFire.com. My name is Jim Sonis. I am a senior writer and analyst for numberFire.com, joined here as mentioned by John Rothstein. Check him out on Twitter at John Rothstein. Find his work over at CBS Sports. And of course, you're on some FanDuel Sportsbook stuff as well. John, happy holidays to you. How you doing today?
Great, Jim. Great to be with you. Happy holidays, my friend.
Appreciate it. Appreciate you swinging by. We had John on last year before the Final Four to break down those games. We talked to him about once a month throughout this season to get some thoughts on the college basketball landscape, get some macro takeaways, and his read on teams across the nation. But now, John, because it's the first time we've had you on this year, I want to talk broad takeaways from the opening month and a half. And I kind of want to check with you, when you're observing all these games, what have been the biggest storylines for you in terms of the landscape of men's college basketball?
We don't have a truly great team in the sport this year. I think there's a couple of teams at the top that have separated themselves. Purdue has had a terrific start to the season. They have obviously the front runner for National Player of the Year in Zach Edey. UConn under Dan Hurley has been sensational, but at the same time, we saw UConn last night get tested and taken to the wire against a Georgetown team that has a losing record and also gave up 102 points to Xavier last week at home. So this is not going to be a season like we had a couple of years ago where Baylor and Gonzaga pushed out from the rest of the pack.
Let's stick on the top of the top of the nation here and talk about those best teams, because it sounds like you believe there's kind of a cluster at the top. Yes. Right now, Houston is the odds-on favorite to win the national championship at FanDuel Sportsbook. They're 7-1. Which teams do you believe belong in that discussion, that top cluster for the top of the nation?
I think it's still evolving. Obviously, we talked about two of them, Purdue, UConn. You obviously throw Houston in there as well. But we're also seeing teams come to the forefront that maybe a week or two ago didn't look like they had an opportunity to be mentioned among the top teams in the country. And, Jim, the person I put, obviously, the team I put, obviously, in that category is UCLA. UCLA was a top 10 team to start the season, did not play well, especially defensively, in back-to-back losses in Las Vegas to Illinois and Baylor, but were dominant defensively last week against Maryland and Kentucky. And Jim, I'll tell you this, the first time that I felt that this UCLA team under Mick Cronin resembled the teams that he had at Cincinnati defensively was last week in back-to-back wins against Maryland and Kentucky, which were two games that were played away from Westwood. The Bruins held their opponents to just 56.5 points per game.
Now, I want to ask you about this because you've been observing college basketball for a very long time at this point. So you kind of have a good read on the undulations of the season, the way things break down. How do you keep yourself from overreacting to what you see in non-conference play when you're trying to extrapolate what they'll do when the intensity of these games cranks up?
Well, this is two things you have to remember. Last year, after 23 games, St. Peter's was 12-11. Here's another thing you have to remember. Last year, in the final AP Top 25 before the NCAA tournament, North Carolina was not ranked. And another thing to add to that, there's been so much panic, obviously, out of Lexington, Kentucky, after Kentucky only scored 53 points against UCLA on Saturday. You have to give UCLA's defense credit for that. And you also have to keep in mind that John Calipari's teams always make their biggest jump directly after Christmas. So, Jim, as somebody has said before, this is only December.
I can't imagine who that somebody would possibly be there. Now, you talked about UCLA as a team that had high expectations, struggled a bit, and then bounced back. When you look across the nation, it could be UCLA. Which teams that you had high expectations for that maybe disappointed so far, which of those teams do you think have the potential to bounce back as the year goes along?
I still believe in Creighton. Because they had showed promise in Maui of being a Final Four caliber team. Beat Texas Tech, beat Arkansas, lost by 2 points against Arizona. They then went to Texas, did not have a great shooting game, still almost won that game. Creighton has had this slide without Ryan Kalkbrenner at the 5, who is the Big East Defensive Player of the Year, started to feel ill against Nebraska, which was an inexcusable loss, and didn't play in subsequent losses to BYU, Arizona State, and Marquette. So the issue for me with Creighton is Ryan Kalkbrenner's health and also Creighton's lack of depth. They need more off the bench from guys like Francisco Farabello and also Frederick King, but I still think Creighton has the chops.
So let's say you're digging in. You're looking at teams like Creighton, UCLA, trying to determine what their outlook is when they've been underwhelming. Are you looking primarily at health to decide if they have the potential to bounce back? Is it youth, coaching? What are you looking for to decide whether a team can buck early season struggles?
Well, for me, the Creighton part, when you look at health, is a bigger factor than other teams because Creighton does not get a lot off its bench. I was going over my numbers and I wrote this in my daily column, The Breakfast Buffet at collegehoopstoday.com for today. Creighton's 5 starters, Ryan Kalkbrenner, and Ryan Nembhard, I always say Andrew Nembhard, Trey Alexander, Baylor Shireman, and Arthur Kaluma combined to average over 82% of Creighton's points. So if you take away one starter like Ryan Kalkbrenner, who again is the Big East Defensive Player of the Year, you are going to have a hard time replacing that type of production.
So you're just trying to analyze team by team, basically, and decide, can this team withstand injuries? How much would an injury matter to them as the guy gets back and stuff like that? And it does seem like it's a team by team basis. Now, obviously, everyone wants to look for, okay, this is a team that's done well so far, but they're going to regress. We talk about regression a lot. But I want to flip that a little bit and talk to you about teams that have been good so far that you think are legit. So when you look at the teams that have been surprises in the positive sense so far this year, which ones do you think have the staying power to be legitimate contenders as the year goes along?
Well, I think we've seen Kansas kind of figure out their small ball lineup here in the last couple of weeks. During their 4-game winning streak, they're assisting on over 60% of their made field goals. They have really leaned in to being a great passing team. I also think, Tennessee's defense being the top defensive team in the sport, even though they lost on Saturday against Arizona, we saw Tennessee have a subpar shooting game, but still have a chance to win at the McHale Center without getting great shooting from its starting backcourt of Tyreke Key and Santiago Vescovi. So I think those 2 teams for sure, and other teams, that are in the mix, obviously, I think, have flaws behind that group. Like, I think, we've seen moments from Alabama, we've seen moments from Baylor, but it goes back to the overarching theme. There is no great team this year in college basketball.
So when you look at that and you look at how the fact there has not been a team that's separated, what are you looking for to identify that team that can separate? What to you will be like the signifier that, okay, this team is legit. This team should be the favorite right now.
How good are you when you're not playing on your home court against elite competition? And that's what really stood out to me last week against UCLA. I have been on this beat now, Jim, close to 20 years. The 2 loudest places I have ever been for a game are the Xfinity Center at Maryland and Assembly Hall at Indiana. For UCLA to go into College Park and have Maryland down 37. And look, I think Maryland, who's, being coached by Kevin Willard, did a great job at Seton Hall and has done a great job this year at Maryland, probably played a little bit better than it's capable of in terms of sustaining it during the first month of the season. But for UCLA to have Maryland down 37 on its home floor, that caught my attention. And for UCLA to hold Kentucky to just 53 points. And again, UCLA, talking to their staff after the game, does not feel like they played their best offensively. To me, that got my attention. So I'm looking really, really close to see who can go away from their home court and beat good competition on the road.
Is that part of why it's tough to decipher which teams might be elite this year? Because we haven't seen a lot of conference play. We've seen some, but not a ton yet. And we've seen some like neutral site games with the invitationals and all that. Is that what makes it tougher to decipher which teams can separate from the pack?
No question. And I think another thing you have to keep in mind too is that, things in life in terms of success are very fleeting. It's the same in college basketball. I was courtside at Madison Square Garden. Illinois came back, beat Texas, had a great win, and then came back a couple days later and got blown out in Champaign by double figures against a rock-solid Penn State team. So things can change on 2 or 3 days' notice, and we're going to see more of that as we move forward into conference play.
So let's shift our focus forward beyond conference play and talk about the conference championship market. We can talk about the futures market right now. We talked about Houston being the favorite 7-1. UConn is 10-1, and then Arizona and UCLA, which we talked about a lot, are 14-1. Now it could be the championship market. It could be conference outrights. Anywhere you want to go. Are there teams you think are undervalued in the betting markets right now, John, based on what you've seen thus far?
Yeah, I would take a look at Xavier. I think that Xavier is a team who, is obviously coached in his second stint, but first year under Sean Miller that has the chance to get better and better as the season progresses. Jim, it's interesting. I talked to Sean Miller last week and he was telling me that, one of the things he worked on last season when he was out of coaching was getting better offensively as a coach. So he studied film of Purdue, of Gonzaga, of what Tommy Lloyd did at Arizona to become more intricate offensively. And this Xavier team is kind of the polar opposite of the teams that Sean Miller has coached throughout his career because it's been elite offensively and not as good defensively. But Xavier has a team, remember, that almost beat Indiana at home. They were a layup away and missed, in the final seconds, and had an 8-point lead against Gonzaga in the PK 85 and blew the game. But you're starting to see now, I think, them settle into a rhythm. Sule Boom, the transfer from UTEP, is, I think, the best transfer in the Big East, along with Providence's Bryce Hopkins. So Xavier is a team that I think, has the requisites, if they can get better defensively, to be one of the monitors we get into conference play. And Xavier is going to come to New York next week to play St. John's. And then New Year's Eve will host UConn at the Cintas Center. So you know how I feel. Who needs the college football playoff?
That's right. That's right. Xavier right now, 75-1 to win it all, 7-1 to win the conference. When you look at Xavier, do you think they have the upside to win it all, or is this more so looking at them as a potential conference contender?
Yeah, I don't have them ranked yet, in the top 25. They're just outside. But I think when we look at the landscape of the Big East, I'm looking at them. They won a close game last night against Seton Hall. Obviously, they have a very, very complete starting five. They're well coached. I'm really looking closely to see how Xavier can continue to evolve, from a defensive perspective. Because, look, Marquette lost to Providence last week. I don't think Marquette is going to be in a position to, compete for a Big East regular season title, although I do expect them to make the NCAA tournament. And then UConn's UConn. So I think Xavier, Creighton, UConn, Marquette, that quartet on good footing for the Big East.
Now, before you go, John, I want to ask you one thing, because I'm going to be snowed in for the next week or so. So I've got downtime. I got downtime to burn. So when you look at the schedule, I know there's a bit of a lull here in the schedule coming up, but when you look at the schedule, like through New Year's, which are the key games you want to see to determine if, how good these teams actually are right now? What are the key games you're watching in the next week or so?
I think any conference game in a power conference is one that you want to, carve time out on your schedule for. I also think there's going to be games around the holidays where if you are a true college basketball junkie, you want to dive in and get a glimpse. Utah State lost to Weber State earlier in the week, but they go to the Diamond Head Classic, a field that also features Rick Pitino and Iona, one of the best mid-majors in the country. That field's also going to have Washington State, who looks obviously vastly improved since Jabe Mullins got back on the floor. The transfer from St. Mary's can really open up the offense with his ability to shoot the basketball. And, then we'll really get into things at the end of December. A ton of great Big 12 conference games are going to be played on New Year's Eve. And then New Year's Day as well, we've got some conference games. UCLA is going to go on the road to the Great Northwest, to start Pac-12 play after Christmas. Washington and Washington State on the road. So you know how the saying goes. Some people have hobbies. I watch college basketball.
That is right. And it'll be a great hobby for the next week or so. John, I appreciate the time. Happy holidays to you. Stay safe during the holiday season. And I'm looking forward to talking to you once again here very soon.
Thanks, Jim. We sleep in May.
All righty. That is John Rothstein. Check him out on Twitter at John Rothstein. Like I said, we'll have him on a couple of times throughout the season to get his read on the men's college basketball landscape, talk about futures markets, and much more. You can find John on Twitter if you have somehow not followed yet, John, at John Rothstein. He is, of course, a men's college basketball insider for CBS Sports. Now, this is not our lone podcast for today here on Covering the Spread, because coming up later on today, we're going to have our NFL Week 16 preview. Austin Swaim will join me to break down his thoughts on NFL Week 16, talking weather, talking the biggest games in the slate, and getting you ready for that. To get that as it is posted, make sure you are subscribed to Covering the Spread wherever you get your podcasts. We, of course, are on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us. And while you're there, If you like what you hear, leave us a rating and review as well. Looking to get more out of the NFL season? Well, now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's free bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It is safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can get bet on everything from the money line to touchdown scores to over-under yards. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with the same game parlay. So don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in free bets when you join FanDuel. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NFL. Must be 21 plus in select states. First online real money wager only. Refund issued as non-withdrawable free bets that expire in 14 days. Restrictions apply. See terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit fanduel.com/RG. In Arizona, 1-800-NEXT-STEP or text NEXT-STEP to 53342. In Connecticut, 1-888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org/chat. In Indiana, 1-800-9-WITH-IT. In Kansas and Wyoming, 1-800-522-4700. And in Kansas, ksgamblinghelp.com. Louisiana, 1-877-770-STOP. In Maryland, mdgamblinghelp.org. In New York, 1-877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY. Or in West Virginia, 1-800-GAMBLER.net. Once again, big thank you to John Rothstein for swinging by for today, breaking down his thoughts on the men's college basketball landscape. Find John on Twitter at John Rothstein. We are back once again later on today to talk NFL Week 16, our final show of the week due to the holiday schedule. We'll have 3 shows next week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday to get you set for NFL Week number 17. We'll talk to you once again later on to break down this blustery NFL slate. This has been Covering the Spread right here on the FanDuel Podcast Network.